This is All India Radio. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on India's roadmap at the UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow. The participants are Dr. C.K. Varshney, environmentalist, and Sanjay Jha, journalist.
Prime Minister Modi made big, bold plays at Climate Summit in Glasgow and said India will go carbon neutral by 2070. Place was among 5 commitments by the Prime Minister at the COP26 conference in Glasgow. This looks like a practical long-term target, keeping in mind our development and aspirational targets. Professor Varshney, were you expecting such a big, bold statement by our Prime Minister at this conference?
I think this is a very important declaration that has been made by the Indian Prime Minister, Shri Modi ji. And it only really says that India is very serious about the issues of climate change. While we find that the global community is still not at same wavelength in terms of taking climate change with the seriousness that it deserves. Considering the economic and social development of India, and also considering the current as well as the total historical contribution of India, which is very, very small as compared to many other countries, the kind of commitment that has been made is quite substantial, and it is likely to be improved further in future as we develop our technology as well as renewable energy resources. And I think that India has given very positive and very practical suggestions in addition to this also. It is also really committed by the Prime Minister that 500 gigawatt of renewable energy will be installed by 2030. And 50% of our energy needs will be met by 2030 from renewable energy resources. In addition, there will be 1 billion ton reduction in the carbon emission by 2030. And the fifth one is that by 2030, the energy intensity will be reduced to 45% from now. Earlier, our commitment was only 35%. So all these things demonstrate very clearly that India is serious in spite of our great need of economic and social development to really take these kind of commitments and declaring it publicly in a global platform to show our commitment. I think there were more important points that were made, and one of them was lifestyle changes, because lifestyle has a great bearing on carbon emission. And in fact, it is the lifestyle of the people in the developed world which has been largely responsible for disproportionate emission of carbon dioxide and the greenhouse gases by them in the past, and also it is continuing. So I think these are some of the things which are required to be given very serious thought.
Professor Varshney, you spoke how India has set this ambitious target. Our target time is only 10 years more than China and 20 more than US and European Union, which are far more developed because of our enhanced share of green energy and other environment-friendly. Government of India has been working on a slew of schemes to safeguard the environment and to promote a greener India. So what are the initiatives you think we could see in the coming time to achieve this target?
So I think there are many initiatives which we have already to a certain extent achieved in a big way. For example, the transition from incandescent bulb to the fluorescent bulb. It is a very major change. And at the same time, it's a question of providing reliable as well as less polluting cooking energy to our domestic users throughout the country, and for which programmed activity has been unfolded and it is taking shape. You are right that we have got tremendous amount of developmental needs for which we will need more energy. But then at the same time, the global community has to think about the carbon justice, because the carbon space is a common pool resource. And if it is filled by the developed countries because of their past emission, and whatever residual is left for the others to use, I think this is injustice. And one of the developmental goals that we have says that disparity has to be removed. So I think these are some of the things about which we have to really think very carefully. the more important point that the Prime Minister has made and has been speaking on behalf of the developing countries is the question of financial assistance, which the developed countries have to provide, which they have promised and which they have not been able to keep. So I think looking at the kind of seriousness that should have been there is somehow lacking. And thus aggressive targets which are expected at this time have not been forthcoming in a very enthusiastic manner. I must also point out that the Paris Agreement and the kind of carbon neutrality that we are talking cannot be achieved unless the ecological systems are maintained, improved and supported. And about which I must say that there has been very little talk about the biodiversity conservation, because 50% of the emission is absorbed and neutralized by the oceans, by the forests, wetlands and grasslands and other natural ecosystems. And we find that because of the new minerals and the greater need for industrialization and many other resources that we are trying to tap, these resources are a danger. And thus, it will be difficult to achieve neutrality unless at the same time there is also a commitment to create net zero loss of biodiversity, which has to be an important ingredient to really achieve the kind of net zero that countries are trying to propose.
Professor Vasni, I would like to talk about, unlike countries in the West or even China, India is decades away from its peak in terms of economic growth and energy consumption. And obviously, our energy demand is expected to grow faster than any other country over the next few years. So India, which is one of the most vulnerable to the impacts of global warming, and we are already actually bearing the harsh consequences of climate breakdown. We have seen flood, in Kerala, millions across the country are exposed to severe heat, water shortage, extreme weather events, and which has all been increasing in the recent years. So obviously, this announcement by our Prime Minister has injected a new life into the talks. It was a chance for obviously India to show that it can deliver on both economic development and climate change, and it seems to have delivered. Do you think that India has now put the ball in the court of the developed world? We have done our bit, despite the challenges that we have to grow, we have to develop, and we are also facing the climate change. But now it is your turn to fulfill your commitment.
Exactly. I will say that you have really hit the nail. If you see that what has happened after Paris Climate Accord, whatever India committed at that point, it is almost going to realize much earlier than the targeted time. While other countries have dragged their feet and have been totally lacking in meeting their commitments. Number one is United States. You know that they have withdrawn from climate change. It is only now that they have entered. And we have yet to see that how far they are able to contribute and how far they are going to compensate for the time which has already gone. And secondly, as about China is concerned, it is very difficult to what happens in China and what they are intending to do. But they have already declared what they have declared at Paris Summit. And beyond that, they are not going to really add any new commitment. And thus, whatever India is saying, our track record shows that we are serious about it and we are making every effort to really meet our commitment and to deliver. And I think we have already proposed in this direction few initiatives which have now gained recognition globally by the international community. First is the Solar Alliance, and the activities within that are now very actively being pursued. And I think it has a lot of promise to deliver. And the second thing is Disaster Risk Reduction Alliance, which the Prime Minister has proposed in order to really pool the resources of the countries to meet the emergent situation which an individual country and developed country is incapable of handling these major so-called which are in fact initiated by human mismanagement, the natural disasters. So I think these are very positive things.
Professor Varshney, before the starting of this summit in Glasgow, the world's eyes was fixated on India, US, and China. President Joe Biden did not bring anything substantially new to the table. Chinese president decided not to attend in person and offered no new plans to cut emissions. So should not the world community cheer what India has done so far, or what India has offered to do it despite all the challenges and failings by the big nations?
Of course, this is what the world community should really appreciate. And not only this, in spite of our constraints, we have also delivered on the COVID problem. And I think Prime Minister Modi has already mentioned that $1 trillion are really required for the adaptation as well as for meeting the damages and the other costs that are involved because of the climate change and for activities related to this. And the more important thing that we have to remind ourselves as well as to the global community that there is an urgent need of technology transfer on which also the developed countries are dragging their feet, because it is not a question of individual countries winning the game in the climate change. Climate change can only be tackled if it is tackled globally, where we must have a unified commitment as well as we must contribute in respect of our economic development and the prosperity that we have gained at the cost of emitting unfortunately high carbon emission in the past and which we are continuing still.
Professor Varshney, you touched upon climate financing to achieve the target. Now the Prime Minister has already set our target. The real challenge is obviously figuring out how to finance the transition to net zero, which is going to require trillions of dollars of investment. Prime Minister Modi obviously reiterated that rich countries should help support poor nations by raising more money to accelerate the shift to the clean energy. I think it is expectations of the developing countries like India that the world should be able to generate $1 trillion for this climate finance. You think that is going to be realistically possible, or we also have to do something within our own economic planning to generate more funds for this switchover? How is that going to happen?
Apparently, it looks very difficult. But fact of the matter is, if we are really serious about climate change and to contain and cap emission of greenhouse gases, we must realize that there is a huge subsidy that is being provided to the petroleum industry, which runs into $10 trillion plus. And there is a time that has come that we should withdraw, because we must stop further mining of these petroleum products. And if we withdraw that, then this sum is available. So the question is a question of taking a very serious auditing as to where the countries are spending their money. So on one hand, we are really providing huge subsidies, which is given to the petroleum industry, to the fossil fuel industry, which ultimately is responsible for the kind of problems that we have. And I think on the other hand, we find that we do not have resources. So I think it is a question of reallocating resources, keeping high priority of climate change. I think it should be possible.
Professor Varshney, let's hope that if we are able to find a solution and the world leaders attending COP26 would work together in common cause to tackle climate change and solve the most insurmountable problems. And the summit's legacy should be that they recognize the time for the words has now moved to time for the action. Thanks a ton for your time.
Thanks.
You were listening to a discussion on India's roadmap at the UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow. The participants were Dr. C.K. Varshney, environmentalist, and Sanjay Jha, journalist. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. You can listen to it on our mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel, News on AIR Official. You may email your opinion about this program at airnsdtalks@gmail.com.